Good morning and welcome. This is Community Focus. My name is Mark McKenzie. This morning we're going to open your eyes, give you lots of information as you hear. I don't want to call it a debate about this, but there's going to be a lot of talk about it. There's already been some about infrastructure in America, but we're going to get local, we're going to get statewide, and we are extremely lucky to have, if you've ever watched the York County Commissioners, I used to cover those meetings. John Klinedinst used to talk all the time. Whenever there was a project that had to be done, he's telling the commissioners, and I'm talking everything from cupolas to roads and bridges, and he is the president and CEO of Davidson Incorporated.
I wear two hats as president and CEO of CS Davidson, and I also serve as the appointed county engineer for York County.
And they allow you to do that. You don't have to...
That's correct. My services are actually provided through CS Davidson to the county, but the county code requires a designated employee or a staff person as the county engineer, so they appointed me.
So whenever you hear about all these different projects, you always brief the commissioners, and usually they take a vote, they listen to what you have to say, and then they approve it. That's usually, right?
That is correct. I've been county engineer since 1980, so I have a lot of accumulated knowledge about the county facility.
Your track record speaks for itself. Well, when we talk about infrastructure, I think most people think roads and bridges, but it's a little bit more than that.
It's a lot more than that.
Well,
we have
as
bridges,
an engineer,
we have bridges, which are probably the most prevalent here in York County because we have 94 bridges in York County. We don't have very much in the way of county-owned roads, a few miles. Most of the roadways we have here in York County are either PennDOT or Turnpike Commission, and a lot of local roads that are owned and maintained by townships and boroughs and the city. But predominantly for York County, the important part is the bridges.
Is it hard to, as you manage this, because it is such a milieu of responsibilities, wherever you go, all right, who's responsible for this, state, local?
It's difficult to understand if you're not familiar with it because they all look the same. They typically look the same. You can't tell who the ownership is. But we do in the inventory system. Bridges, for instance, are inspected at least every 2 years, so we know whose bridges are whose and who owns them and who's responsible for maintaining them.
I don't know if we can talk about history at all, just to kind of give folks a little perspective. You know, in the history of our region, the most famous bridge is probably the one that burned between Wrightsville and Columbia. The pilings or whatever they are, they're still in the river. So a lot of people see it. They've made a historical event out of it. Every 5-year anniversary, they go out there and light pyres on fire. We have a few other roads that are well known. We have the railroad that Lincoln came in on. So we have some historical memory of these things. But what does it come to mean these days? We're talking about moving people, moving rail, moving products. Can you talk a little bit about the history of this region? You know, we had Conestoga wagons were originally from here.
Well, that's correct. And the one part you missed, we actually have one of the more famous highways going right through the county, the Lincoln Highway. We have had at least 6 bridges over the Susquehanna River as the state or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania developed from the east to the west. So the Wrightsville-Columbia area was the gateway for quite some time. So our transportation network developed heading west.
Were bridges and roads back then, were they mostly toll roads? I mean, how did that work?
My understanding is they were almost always toll roads. That's how they paid for them. They were typically local investors, and they got paid back through the tolls.
So there's always been a price to pay.
That's correct.
to travel.
One way or the other, you're going to pay for it.
There is freedom, but there's no free ride, I guess
that's correct. And that's capitalism at its best. There was a banking consortium from Columbia that built one of the bridges. As a matter of fact, I believe it's the one that was burned down by the Union forces in 1863. That was an investment. They were capitalists. They built the bridge. They were expecting to be paid back from the tolls.
So now here we are, and a lot of folks are talking about investment in infrastructure. And I think sometimes maybe people get confused, and I think it's natural because You have the president, for example, talking about infrastructure mainly in terms of employment, putting people back to work, having these projects. But then on the other side, and I'm going to guess, as an engineer, you're looking at this from I'm going to call them products. We have current products that are wearing out, and we need a replacement for those products. The fact that they might accomplish two things is neither here nor there. Our focus here is on the quality of these products. So your view is infrastructure, the conversation is more about upgrading what we already have?
Well, saying it a little bit differently,
Yeah,
and
please.
it's a complicated subject, but we have several issues. I like to say that when the day you finish building something in the infrastructure, it begins to wear out. So the way to prolong the design life of that is you maintain it. And when you either don't maintain it or can't maintain it, or it's beyond its maintenance life, then you're into replacement. It's obviously a lot cheaper to maintain than it is to replace. On a maintenance standpoint, we have a lot of tools on our palette that we can use to maintain structures and prolong their life. And when it comes to replacement, we have new technology and new ways of replacing things, but they begin to wear out as soon as you finish building them.
And it is also, I think, when politicians get involved. I mean, I'll just give you one: the pension system. The pension system. You're talking about adults who have. They have contracts. We have multiple years. They were supposed to put money in. They don't. And then it becomes a problem, 20, 30 years down the road. And we have something similar to that. Sometimes, it's not quite as bad because that's out of sight, out of mind. Roads and bridges, if your bridge doesn't work, you're probably going to notice that.
Well, that's correct. And there are targeted funding streams for maintenance of the infrastructure, like the liquid fuels tax through the state. But that's not anywhere near enough to maintain and replace the infrastructure that we need to replace. So then you're relying on the general fund, the tax receipts. And that's always part of the discretionary part of the budget. And the first thing that gets cut when they're doing budget negotiations is the discretionary part. So consequently, maintenance typically on almost everything is underfunded.
And then that only increases the survivability, the quality of the structure as it is. So that means that replacement is probably going to come sooner.
That's correct. Maintenance will extend the design life of whatever it is, whether it be a road or a bridge, until such time you have to replace it. But there's some examples here in York
Please,
County that
go.
are actually
Yes.
pretty good. There's we have bridges, probably, I'm going to say over half of our bridges are more than 50 years old. We have a bridge in York County that's still in service that was built in 1887.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that it's past its normal design life. It is structurally deficient and functionally obsolete, and I don't want anybody to be afraid of that. Structurally deficient just means that it can't carry legal load limits, and functionally obsolete just means that it's probably a one-lane bridge. It's got something that doesn't meet the function.
And we're not talking about like a covered bridge that looks nice and it has some, historical, this looks nice. Oh, an 1888 bridge. Oh, that sounds...
Well, we actually do have that concern, though, and when we go to replace bridges, if you use the federal funding, then you do have to analyze the historical value of the structure, and in some cases, you can't take the structure down.
And see, that goes to so many layers of the problem. I mean, and that's one of the problems of this program. I'm going to say it up front. It is so big and so huge that we are going to kind of jump around a little bit because it's going to. But the problem isn't just money. The problem is political in some ways, and it is taking these projects takes several years to put together. We're going to get to that. And I also want to talk about funding, technology as well. You're listening to Community Focus. My name is Mark McKenzie. I'm going to talk as little as possible because we are lucky enough to have here the president and CEO of CS Davidson and Son, and they are an engineering firm.
We're a consulting civil engineering firm.
And John is the county engineer and has been so for over 3 decades. The bridges, let's focus in on that just for a little bit. According to the ASCE, which is the main engineering oversight, they do a report card frequently. They say Pennsylvania bridges get a D+, It says that Pennsylvania has the highest percentage of structurally deficient bridges in the country. That's not something we're going to put on our welcome signs when people come in, right?
No, that's not a good thing. But we are doing a better job of doing something about that. And I just want to reassure the listeners and you that bridges are a unique piece of infrastructure because they are inspected by federal law at least every 2 years. If there's something wrong with them, more frequently. So we know their condition, we know what they need, and the inspectors are required. It's a very rigorous inspection. They are required, if there is a safety issue on that bridge, they are required to close that bridge immediately. So to the traveling public, there are measures of safety built into the program. So we know the condition of the bridges. We then can begin to assess their condition. We know the inventory. We can assess their condition. We can evaluate them. We can decide what they need. Then we can begin to program them and schedule repairs, but that's then where the money comes in.
The problems with these bridges, we've had a couple. One, there was an accident. A tanker truck flips over and burns. All the fuel burns. Caused millions of dollars on an off-ramp and part of a highway. This was up in Cumberland-Dauphin County, and that really caused huge problems. But, in an emergency, they were able to get the funding. They were able to really fast-track that because that thing got repaired pretty quickly.
That's correct, and that was done in a very expedited fashion. I believe there was a local York contractor that worked on that. But that when you have an emergency like that, then
that's the exception.
You can circumvent some of the bidding requirements, and you can operate on an emergency basis.
They also had the 95 bridge in Delaware, where I guess somebody dumped some sand, and they kept dumping it, and it ended up creating. That sounded kind of weird. I'm not an engineer, so that sounded kind of weird. Did that make sense to you?
That did not make sense.
Okay.
To me. And luckily for us in York County, we don't have most of our bridges are single span or double span, so we don't have the type of traffic you're talking about. But an accident can happen on any bridge. And on some of our wrought iron trusses or steel trusses, if we have an accident, somebody drives into one of the structural members, there could be a catastrophic failure. That we do spend a lot of time on guide rails and protection of the structure.
Is there a problem with the number of different kinds of bridges we have?
We have a lot of different kinds. I wouldn't say there's a problem, but we do have several uniques because the technology in 1887 when they were building that bridge is different than the technology that we would use today, where predominantly we would use concrete, not steel. It lasts longer.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned, I guess we can jump into technology a little bit here. One of the things I'm from the Northeast, so I don't go home as much as I used to, but when I would travel the turnpikes and the bridges and all of that, a lot of macadam-type roads. But then I came here, and Route 30 was a concrete road. I don't know that I'd ever seen a concrete highway before. And then I read how, it was great. It had a long last way longer than macadam. But then when you do have to replace it, it's a real problem. And so we don't have that in York County, though, not anymore. I guess they paved over it. Is that what they did?
The concrete roads they do last much longer. They do require less maintenance, but when you go to maintain them, you don't replace them. You typically top them with either bituminous material, or some states top it with a concrete material. Well, but either way, you have to maintain those.
In terms of latest technology, I know when they did that for Route 30 from the river in, they used that French product several years ago. I want to say maybe up to 10 years ago, maybe, and it had it was amazing because tires on concrete make a lot of noise, and when they sprayed this stuff on, this top layer on it was amazing. You'd come across and it would get quiet.
We're always searching for that new technology, that new product that will last longer. It's maintenance, but you're always trying to make your maintenance dollars go as far as you possibly can. So, like I said before, we do have a lot of tools in our palette, and we're always looking for that new tool to extend the maintenance.
The bridges problem, though, there was a law passed last fall that provides funding in the state to repair our local bridges. What is necessary? Is that that's on a fast track. That's good now, or does it require more?
That helped tremendously. Act 89 was actually responsible for about $2.3 billion of new investment, and that investment will go to bridge replacement. It'll go to local municipalities for maintaining their roads. So it certainly can't hurt, but it's not going to solve all the problems.
Is it the federal money that's
The federal money, interestingly enough, Pennsylvania made a big step in their funding with Act 89. Right now, the federal trust fund is about to run out of money, and that is critical to the repair of, for the most part, the interstates and the major projects. And if the legislature doesn't do something by August, the trust fund will run out of money, and if it runs out of money, that will mean some of our major projects will begin to come to a stop.
What do you think about, I'm sure people say, well, you think about all the millions of gallons of gas. I think of that on one hand, and then on the other hand, I think of, we're traveling many millions of miles less than we were just 10 years ago. So you have sort of less miles on one hand, you have more efficient vehicles on the other. So do we have enough money coming in?
No, we don't. And both Pennsylvania had a 12 cents per gallon tax. They replaced that with lifting the tax on the oil franchise fee. In the federal level, though, they do rely on a tax. I believe it's 18.4 cents per gallon for gasoline. The problem is, I'm not convinced we're not driving more. We actually, even though the price of gasoline is high, we still continue to drive millions of miles, and we keep adding vehicles. And that's not a variable in the amount of revenue you get. The variable is in the amount of tax revenue you collect from the sale of the gasoline. And unfortunately, from a revenue standpoint, the more efficient we make our cars, the more we go to hybrid cars, the less tax we collect because the less gas we sell. So it's a double-edged sword.
Right. You have more cars using what you have, but they're providing you with less tax revenue to repair what you need.
That's correct. To my earlier point that I'm not convinced we're not driving more miles, I believe the more fair way to tax us on the use of our roads would be on a mileage based, which we certainly have the technology to do.
You're listening to Community Focus. My name is Mark McKenzie. This thing is flying fast, and we're talking with John Klinedinst, the county engineer for York County, and also president and CEO of Davidson Incorporated, and really has been helping work on bridge and road issues for 30, 40 years. And John, let's touch real briefly, just so we can say we did, on rail. They've been talking about rail. Is it because we're just kind of too far out? Normally when we think of rail, we think of subways and those kinds of things around higher density populations, but we don't really have.
Actually,
you tell me.
I would separate that into two categories.
Okay.
Rail, to me, is more freight rail.
Okay.
And the freight rail system in Pennsylvania is not all that bad. It's probably gets a grade of about a B, as I recall, and that's because it's owned and operated by major independent carriers who collect the maintenance fee required in the fares they charge. So it's a self-sustaining infrastructure piece that's doing actually pretty good. The subways and the mass transit systems would fall under the broad category of transit. And I would just, most people don't understand this, but we do have transit systems in every county in Pennsylvania. Red Rose Transit, Rabbit Transit,
yes.
Those are transit systems, and they rely on the use of dollars. And in fact, if they're very effective, they reduce the amount of vehicles we have on the road and provide transit for mass people. So they actually help the system, not hurt the system. But the more they work, the more gasoline doesn't get sold, and the less tax revenue comes in.
One question the only question I really wanted to ask about rail had to do with these oil trains, where we're hearing lots of talk about it. Regulators are starting to get concerned because of accidents, and a lot of people don't know that the number of these trains, they used to truck oil by train for many years, but because of the Marcellus Shale, although that's gas, other tar sands and things like that, it has exploded exponentially. Maybe that's a wrong word to use. Has increased exponentially What's your assessment of that?
Well, I think the use of rail freight is increasing tremendously.
Regardless
of what the product is that
Okay.
they're carrying. Actually, I read somewhere where I think we're back to pre-World War II levels of rail use. So rail is coming back in a strong way, and unfortunately that will carry with it the safety issues of what is going across those rails.
Yeah, they had a big accident up in Quebec, I believe. Almost 50 people died in that fire. And they're talking about that, and people in Pennsylvania should probably pay a little bit of attention to, because we had an oil train accident in Philadelphia where it kind of derailed, I guess, on a bridge, which was, it happened, and it was a high population area. It was over a waterway as well. So they had one in Lynchburg, Virginia as well, and that one did catch fire. And so it's something that we got to pay attention to. And I really want to hop on the roads in the time we have remaining, so I can say that we got to as many of these things as possible. And really the road issue is capacity, isn't it?
That's correct.
I mean, we only have so many roads. When I moved here, I thought, wow, this is great. I had 222 for north and south, 83 for north and south. I had Route 30. I had the Turnpike. It was a nice box, and I felt I could get anywhere in a pretty quick period of time. And I'm used to that from being in New England, where we had 95 and all the highways around Boston and all that. But it's crazy now.
The situation is we need to make sure that we take care of the infrastructure we have and replace the infrastructure that's not of any life anymore. But that doesn't add capacity necessarily. And capacity, I think you're going to see some very innovative methods being used to increase capacity on roads, because the money's just not there to add capacity.
And what you mean by that is we're not going to have a 6-lane I-83.
Well, I believe a 6-lane I-83 is being looked at, but that's an excellent example of, well, maybe 6 lanes of 83 isn't the way to go. Maybe platooning cars through or convoying cars through, essentially bumper to bumper, gets more cars through faster than adding lanes.
But would I rely on the guy in front of me?
I believe the technology is there to allow the vehicles to control themselves.
So that's what when I see car commercials these days, you see. I think it was maybe Mercedes or some car. Just over the weekend, I saw a commercial where the car will stop you if it sees a stoppage in front of you. So even if you were talking to someone, it'll stop it on its own.
Absolutely.
And there will be
technology is available. It's being used. And so the future answer of capacity issues on our infrastructure and other issues on our infrastructure may be solved by technology, not by physically
What
expanding.
about those, the other idea that we've got when you're talking about platooning, I guess, driverless cars? I mean, is that what you're referring to?
That would be very, very similar, where the vehicles would actually control themselves through that section.
But engineering-wise, I see why that makes sense. But, perception is I'm going to get in a car and I'm not going to, even though I might be eating or, women might be putting mascara on, you know what I mean? Now they could do it safely under those conditions.
It will be a huge cultural shift, but then look at the other technology that has changed our lives, the iPhone, all the technology
Yes.
changes, and it makes us think a different way. And in some cases, it's scary.
In the time we have remaining, and we have hit on so many different things, is there something we haven't talked about which you think the listener could use as they hear conversations about infrastructure take place?
Well, just two things I would point out. One, we have got to spend the money and maintain the infrastructure we have, because the cost not to maintain it is higher than the cost to maintain it. The York County Economic Alliance made that pitch to the legislators when they passed Act 89, and we believe it is absolutely true. The cost to us is higher. And think about the cost of detours and the costs of suspension modifications on your car. The cost is more. You have to maintain this stuff. And secondly, there's no money tree out there. It's us. We're using the roads. We're using the infrastructure. We have to pay for it.
Yeah, that first point about, when you see the backup of cars, people get frustrated when they're not able to go. but I guess they feel that, and I hate to generalize and put words in people's mouths, but I would say that they feel that, the money isn't. Do you think the money is being used as efficiently as it can be now, and they feel that more money won't solve the problem?
That's a common misperception. I will tell you that I think the issue is that we don't have enough money. But the money that's being used, everyone's looking for more efficient ways to use the money. We're trying to get the biggest bang for the buck. The current Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, Barry Shoke, has done wonders at PennDOT to try to increase the efficiency of how the processes work to replace structures and how the whole permitting process works. And I think he's on the right path. I hope that continues. That's a hard perception to change with people who still have this stereotype of a PennDOT road crew, and I won't even repeat it because everybody understands it. But those days are long gone. And can you find inefficiencies? You can find inefficiencies in any process, anywhere.
Well, why are we always looking for perfection? Obviously, we should try to seek that, but at some point, the devil is in the details, and we have a larger problem to fix. If the choice is perfect or not do it.
Somebody told me one time that perfect is the enemy of good. We need to get as much done as we possibly can with the funds that we have available. Expecting perfection is just not going to happen.
John Klinedinst is not only the county engineer for York. We've relied on his. If you've driven on a York County road, he's been. It's what would you call, like your guardian angel?
Observer.
Yeah,
maybe.
there you go. Overs, keeping a close eye on it, and also president and CEO of Davidson Incorporated consulting firm, and we have relied on him for the last roughly 30 minutes to take us inside this issue as you hear conversations about it, and lots of good information and good perspective as well. I appreciate you being here this morning. That's going to do it for Community Focus. I'm Mark McKenzie.